Welcome to episode 4 of the Sourdough Can Be Simple podcast. I'm glad you joined me today. We are going to be diving into possibly my favorite topic when it comes to sourdough, and that is using freshly milled whole grain flour in your sourdough. So I have been using freshly milled flour in my sourdough baking for a while, and it was kind of a journey, to be honest with you. If you've tried it and failed, you understand. It can be just a little bit tricky to get used to, but after quite some time, I have finally, I would like to say, kind of broken the code as far as getting really nice loaves of bread and other products out of using freshly milled flour in my sourdough baking. So why would you want to use freshly milled flour in sourdough? In my opinion, a loaf of bread that is long fermented, and when I say that, I mean at least 8 hours, and it uses freshly milled flour that was milled just before that you made the bread, that is the most healthy loaf of bread, in my opinion, that you can have. For a couple of reasons. The long fermentation makes the bread more digestible. That's always been kind of the pull to use sourdough, is because of that fermentation process. But it also can make nutrients more available to absorb because of the fermentation process. Well, when you use all-purpose flour, it doesn't have really any nutrition. And let me explain why. All-purpose flour is flour that has been mechanically sifted. It is sifted so much that the only thing left is pretty much starch. And there's no vitamins, there's no minerals. And because of this, way back, many, many years ago, at the turn of the century, they started adding the vitamins and minerals back in because people were getting sick because they weren't getting those essential nutrients from their bread products. But when you use freshly milled flour, you have all of that nutrition intact because the bran and the germ, that's what holds the nutrition, are intact. So when you make sourdough bread with this very, very healthy flour, it's a win-win. The sourdough process makes all of those nutrients more available for your body to absorb, and it increases the fiber exponentially over using all-purpose flour. So using freshly milled flour in sourdough is your sure bet to have bread that is the most filling, the most nutritious, and the most delicious, because freshly milled flour also adds a tremendous amount of flavor to your bread that all-purpose flour does not. So that's the why. Let's talk about how bread made with sourdough and freshly milled flour is different from that with all-purpose flour. When you make bread with freshly milled flour, the technique is a bit different. Because that bran and germ is intact, building the gluten in that dough takes a little more finesse because the bran and the germ are kind of like little shards in the dough. And it's hard. It takes a little longer. It's not harder. It just takes a little longer to build the gluten in the dough. And also, when you bake your loaf, it may not get quite as airy on the inside and have all those like really big holes. But I can tell you that my loaves are very nice on the inside. They have holes, but not like really big holes. Also, the bread doesn't puff up quite as much as all-purpose flour, because all-purpose flour obviously is a bit lighter because it's missing the parts that have the nutrition. It's just kind of almost like powder. And so those are like the big differences as far as looking at the bread. The taste is completely different. When you taste a loaf of bread made with all-purpose flour, which is what we're all kind of used to. I know I grew up on that, and it really doesn't have flavor. So you add flavor by adding your sandwich filling or adding butter or something like that. And I'm not going to, lie to you and try to act like I don't like all-purpose bread, flour, sourdough. I do. I really do. But once you eat sourdough bread made with freshly milled flour, it feels like it's the first time you're tasting bread because it has flavor. You don't even have to add anything to it. It's just that it's so delicious, and you can tell the difference immediately on that part. Also, the fiber. Most people do not get enough fiber in their diets. Fiber is so important. I am a prior nurse, and I did take classes on this, and I can tell you from a medical standpoint that fiber is extremely important for your health. It helps lower your cholesterol. It helps with a healthy digestive system, and it also helps with keeping you full longer so that you're not eating within an hour or feeling hungry after you have a sandwich. If you eat a sandwich with freshly milled flour sourdough bread, it's very, very filling, and it holds you for much longer. So those are some differences in using freshly milled flour versus all-purpose flour and sourdough. Now let's talk about techniques to help you be successful in making a really nice loaf of bread with freshly milled flour. Number one is soaking the flour, at least a portion of it. You don't have to soak all of it, but you do need to soak a portion of it to soften, not break down, but soften the bran and the germ so that it's easier to build the gluten and the structure of the dough. Once you let it soak for at least 30 minutes, I like to go an hour if I can, and make sure I really got that broken down before I start the kneading or the stretching and the folding. It makes a huge difference. The texture, the rise, everything is different if you take the time to do that. So let's say you're going to make a loaf of artisan sourdough bread. I have one going right now in my kitchen, and I put it on at around 9 o'clock. It's almost 11 now. I didn't start doing my stretch and folds until 10 o'clock. And the difference between each stretch and fold is just really noticeable as you go, especially with the freshly milled flour sourdough. And so that kind of leads me into kneading, stretching, and folding. When you're using freshly milled flour in sourdough, I have found that it takes a little longer to build the gluten. So I said that before, but let's say that you're doing stretch and folds like I'm doing today. Normally with an all-purpose artisan loaf, I would do like 3, maybe 4 sets of stretch and folds. But with my whole grain loaves, my freshly milled loaves, I will do at least 6, and I will do them all the way up sometimes to the point where I'm putting it in the banneton basket. And it doesn't hurt anything, and it actually makes the bread better. So I do not put a limit on how many stretch and folds that I do, because every time I go to it, it is more and more stretchy. It is more and more developed, and I can tell just a huge difference in the outcome of that bread. When I do that, then if I'm in a hurry and I just do like 5 minutes of kneading in a mixer and let it rise, I can tell a big difference in the way that the bread turns out. So let's say you're kneading the dough either by hand or in a mixer. You can do it either way. I say knead it for 10 minutes or until it is very stretchy, smooth, and you can stretch it apart till it's almost see-through before it breaks. That is called a window pane test. And you really, really need to be diligent to do that with freshly milled flour breads. And so knead it for 10 minutes or so, or until. So it may not take that long depending on the mixer you have. The Bosch mixer, I can achieve that in like 6 minutes. And the Nutrimil Artis mixer takes around 8 to 10 minutes. When I had a KitchenAid mixer, it took around 20 minutes. I know that sounds crazy, but the KitchenAid mixers are just different. You have to stop, and then you have to start it back, and you have to stop, and you have to start it back. And so it takes longer. But once you get it to that point, then you'll be surprised at how much better that your freshly milled sourdough loaves turn out, whether you're making a sandwich loaf or an artisan loaf, or whether you're making baguettes or you're making biscuits or whatever. You will see a difference if you allow that gluten to develop properly before you move on to letting it rise. So let's talk about the fermentation time. Fermentation time is just the amount of time that you let that dough sit from the time that you mix it up to the time that you bake it. And we call it, even in yeasted breads, there's a fermentation time because the yeast ferments in the dough. And it's sourdough is yeast, so it's just longer to do it with sourdough. So what you're looking for optimum nutrition and optimum digestion is at least 8 hours from start to finish. Now, I do more on the lines, especially if I'm doing an artisan loaf like I'm doing today, it's closer to 18 to 24 hours. But the last 8 to 10 hours is in the refrigerator. So it's a really slow fermentation. That adds even more flavor, and it just slows everything down so that you have a little more control over when you're going to bake your bread. Now, I will tell you that for me, in my experience, and I've been doing freshly milled flour sourdough products for a long time, they ferment a little quicker. So I will actually get my artisan loaf in the refrigerator way sooner than what I would if I was just using all-purpose flour, or even a portion of all-purpose flour. I will let it rise for maybe, and this is pushing it, like it when it's cooler, like it is right now in my house, I can go like 5 or 6 hours, and then it's going in the fridge. In the summer, 4 hours, it's going in the fridge. But the fermentation process is still happening. It's just slowing it down so it doesn't over-ferment. Over-fermented dough is not the end of the world. I mean, you can use it for other things, and you can make focaccia and pizza dough and different things like that. But if you're really wanting to get, a good rise, and you want it to not flatten out when you put it in the Dutch oven, you want to watch that fermentation time and not push it. So now that it's cool in our house, I don't watch it as closely as I did in the summertime. And so that does make a difference. But keep in mind that sourdough loves freshly milled flour, and it chomps on it, and it will ferment a little bit quicker. So just keep that in mind when you're making your doughs. So in let's kind of recap. Maybe you're making sourdough already, and you are intrigued by the freshly milled flour movement. And I call it a movement now because I was telling my husband just this morning, freshly milled flour is turning into the sourdough of 2020. I mean, it is really taken off, and I love that because we are really learning more about how important it is to have all of these nutrients that we've been missing out on in our store-bought flours. And we're learning that for our families, for our children, that these whole grains are more important than we ever even thought. And I love that the information's out there. There's so many good resources. There's Sue Becker with the Bread Beckers. She has tons of stuff on YouTube. She has a podcast. And I think she's probably responsible for 90% of people getting into freshly milled flour. And I think that's great. You have companies like Nutrimill who are pushing freshly milled flour. They just recently came out with the most affordable grain mill ever. And I have it and I love it. And I think it's great because it is making it more accessible for more people. They are, trying to turn it into this movement that it is. And I'm loving it. Now, the freshly milled flour movement is starting to really push into that freshly milled flour and sourdough movement. And this is where I get most of my questions about sourdough is freshly milled flour. I love that we can make these decisions to make our bread as healthy as possible. I have said this before. So many times in the Bible, Jesus referred to himself as the bread of life. Bread is important, but more so, healthy bread is important. Bread that is full of nutrition is so important. And if you've been on the fence, I highly suggest that you look into getting a grain mill, get some grain, and instead of trying to make a big loaf of sourdough right away, make some muffins, make some pancakes, make some pizza dough. Start learning how to work with it, and you will eventually be using it for everything because it is a very rewarding undertaking to use freshly milled flour and sourdough. I'm a big advocate. I think that it's one of the most underrated things that people can do for their health, and that is milling their own flour. I mean, when I first started a long time ago and got into it, all I had was a Vitamix blender with a dry container, and I would grind my wheat berries in that. And it is just really turned and morphed into this thing where so many people are doing it. And I love it. I look online on Instagram and there's so many accounts for using freshly milled flour, and I think it's great. But I went off on a little thing there. But the main things that you need to keep in mind is to start with, maybe start with hard white wheat because it's the lightest and the least strong in flavor of all of the wheat berries. Start with that. Start with yeast bread and learn how it works. Learn how it feels. Be sure that you soak a portion of your flour for at least 30 minutes. Knead it long enough so that it develops gluten and is stretchy and soft and smooth. And make sure that you ferment it just enough to get a rise and not too much. And you will be highly successful with it in time. It does take a little bit, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Everything worth learning takes time. And I have found that in so many parts of my life, and freshly milled flour and sourdough is no different. But I hope that this episode was helpful to you. If you have been thinking about using freshly milled flour in your sourdough, go for it. I have, some blog posts over on my blog, therosehomestead.com. Head over there, type in freshly milled flour, and you can find some blog posts that I have that go even more in detail on this subject. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Sourdough Can Be Simple podcast, and we will be with you all again next week. Have a great week, and we'll talk with you soon.